Today we're going to talk about a horror game, one that I have been looking forward to for quite some time. I waited a long time before actually playing the stalker horror game Remothered Tormented Fathers, and despite its optimization issues, I really loved it. It had a great story and setup, even though it left a lot of questions unanswered. I was really looking forward to its sequel, which is the second chapter of a trilogy, and something interesting happened. While I didn't receive a review code for the game, I ended up buying both the Switch and PC versions. So instead of just giving you a Switch review, I'm giving you a handheld review. Here is my review of Remothered Broken Porcelain for the Nintendo Switch and PC. When it comes to story, Broken Porcelain is both a prequel and sequel to the original game, Remothered Tormented Fathers. Though despite this mostly being a prequel, you should definitely not play this game first. It spoils a ton of the best twists from Tormented Fathers, and while it does have a little text-based story recap when you start, it really is best to just play the first game and then come to Broken Porcelain. This is about a girl named Jennifer who gets expelled from a girls' institute and gets stuck at the Ashman Inn. Originally a worker there, she ends up being chased around by stalkers and possessed residents that seem to want her dead, making her fight for her life trying to escape. One thing I will say about the story is it did an excellent job at developing and expanding on a lot of things that Tormented Fathers started. Whether we're talking about the characters of Jennifer and Rosemary, the Red Nun, or why many events of the first game happened the way they did, this game answers almost all of the questions that were left out in the open in the first game and really ties things together. When it comes to gameplay, Broken Porcelain is a third-person survival horror game with stealth elements. It is also what you would call a stalker game. Each chapter introduces you to a different stalker that will follow you around at certain points, requiring you to stealth around them to be able to actually get where you need to go. And unlike the original game that only had 2 different stalkers, Broken Porcelain ups the ante, giving you 3 to 4 different stalkers that you encounter across the game, and some areas require you to go through a room or set of rooms, avoiding up to 3 stalkers at the same time. Thankfully, you don't have 4 stalkers chasing you when the game first starts. Each chapter introduces you to different areas of the Ashman Inn and introduces a stalker to you, slowly building things up. That way, you can get used to how the game works, how the stalkers are different from the original game, and how you find items to be able to solve puzzles. Speaking of how the game works, let's talk about how Broken Porcelain improved upon the systems Tormented Fathers made. Stalkers are no longer as fast as you, giving you a lot more options and easeability with running from them and hiding. You've also got more options with items and skills. You find distraction and self-defense items as you explore the hotel, but you can combine things you find into new items, and a new ability this game added was a sneak attack, allowing you to stealthily sneak up on your killers to attack them with a self-defense item like a knife or shovel, being able to injure them and slow their movement down. And when it comes to skills, you can find these little moth keys littered around the inn, and when you get to a special box, you can upgrade passive abilities for better stealth, item use, health regeneration, and the list goes on. Before we get to content and length, let's get to the objectives that you will always have as you progress the story. These objectives or tasks are mostly pretty simple, though it's worth noting the tutorial does not explain a lot of returning mechanics from Tormented Fathers. The main problem I have with the objectives is the end of Chapter 1. Some objectives can be very repetitive, like being able to defeat a stalker with sneak attacks, which setting up a sneak attack isn't really that hard even in that first chapter, which admittedly is more difficult than later chapters, but when it requires you to do it 4 to 6 times in a row where the stalker has incredible perception, it honestly becomes a lot more frustrating than fun. And when it comes to content and length, it is a fairly meaty game. If it's your first time playing the game and you don't use a guide, I would expect to get at least 8 to 10 hours on your first run. Maybe a bit more than that if you have trouble adjusting to the systems or certain areas. It is pretty hard to find some objectives at times with how dark everything is. Before moving on, let's talk about the controls for a moment. The movement around the game is very clunky and stiff no matter where you're playing, though it is a little stiffer on the Switch than on PC. I didn't notice too much in terms of using the analogs to turn around, but hitting the R button to start dashing has a bit of a delay on Switch that I never noticed on PC. Next, let's dive into presentation. The general response to this game on any platform? Oof. People are ripping these developers apart for the bugs and glitches. But let's take a good look at things, and as I said earlier, I'm going to be doing comparisons here between the game on the Switch and on PC via the JPD Win Max. As far as the visuals are concerned, the Nintendo Switch version is extremely blurry with little to no lighting effects, very similar to the Switch version of Tormented Fathers. If you want to compare things, it's equivalent to the PC version's low settings on graphics. When I went over to the GPD and Win Max, I was actually able to keep it at a nice and steady frame rate on high and epic settings, but even with that in mind, the character models of the game are going to be blurry no matter where you're playing it. Playing it on PC definitely helped how clear all of the environments were, but the characters are still blurry. When it comes to frame rate, it is pretty similar between the two systems. The Nintendo Switch runs it at a pretty steady 30 frames per second, though it does tend to drop during transitions, and due to those drops, it sometimes skips parts of cutscenes. Meanwhile, on the Win Max, even with using those high and epic graphic settings, I got the game to run between the 30s and 40s. Now let's dive into the bugs and glitches, and the one thing I will say, yes, there are a lot of really bad bugs and glitches in this game, but it is not unplayable. I was still able to get through the entire game on both platforms. Now let's start diving into the bugs and glitches that I saw. Many events do not trigger properly and require reloads on both platforms. This happened in 3 areas of the PC version and 1 area on the Switch version. Thankfully, this game has manual saves as well as constant auto saves. So if something happens and the game won't go forward on you, all you have to do is go to that last auto save so you don't have to redo a bunch of stuff. But that's not all. A couple things happened with stalkers that were a bit weird. When you take them down and they're supposed to stay down in the story, sometimes they won't stay down, even extending themselves into cutscenes, showing them wandering and attacking characters in the same room but at different time slots. This really messes up character models, though it doesn't actually kill you and end the cutscene. This glitch only happened to me once and only on the Nintendo Switch. The other thing that happens with stalkers is they'll sometimes freeze themselves in place, making it completely impossible to advance without reloading, as even if you walk up to them and have them attack you, they don't get unstuck. And the final thing I'll tell you about is the occasional useful glitch. When I was down in the basement and having to try to subdue a certain stalker, the controls froze on me when I reloaded my save file, and instead of the stalker coming and killing me, it auto-completed my objective, so when I gained back control, I didn't have to deal with him anymore. So the consensus here is yes, there are bugs and glitches everywhere, but it's not unplayable thanks to the autosave system. The PC version has already been patched to help with a lot of these issues, though the Switch version has not. And with that out of the way, let's dive into battery life. On the original model, Broken Porcelain has a battery range of 2 hours and 4 minutes up to 3 hours and 9 minutes. On the Nintendo Switch Lite, it has a range of 3 hours and 22 minutes up to 4 hours and 32 minutes. And on the Redboxer V2 2019 model, it has a range of 4 hours and 44 minutes up to 5 hours and 22 minutes. Now in conclusion, Remothered's second entry is playable on both handhelds and does a lot to expand upon the lore and setup from the first game. Now on the downside, the Switch version is very rough to look at with being extremely blurry and washy. Plus, all versions of the game are extremely buggy and making several save files is definitely recommended. But despite this, if you're a fan of the first game, you should absolutely play this one for the story and lore expansion alone. It's just worth noting that you might want to get it on PC via the Win Max for a more visually pleasing experience, or if you just don't want to wait for a patch. Reviews to go. Rates Broken Porcelain for the Nintendo Switch a 5 out of 10, and for the PC via the Win Max a 5.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.